In Minnesota, a program meant to feed hungry children during the pandemic became the center of one of the largest and most audacious frauds in U.S. history. What began as a lifeline for families in crisis would soon unravel into a web of deception and greed that shocked the nation. The nonprofit Feeding Our Future is accused of stealing at least $250 million, possibly up to $2 billion, meant for child nutrition. The scale of the alleged theft is staggering, with investigators calling it one of the most significant abuses of pandemic relief funds ever uncovered. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was a calculated, organized scheme that exploited a system designed to help the most vulnerable. While children and families waited in line for meals, those entrusted with their care were orchestrating a massive fraud behind closed doors. Funds intended for millions of meals were allegedly diverted into luxury cars, sprawling real estate, and lavish lifestyles. The money that should have filled empty stomachs instead fueled extravagant purchases and personal gain. The scandal is also a story of how fear, specifically fear of being labeled racist, paralyzed oversight and allowed the fraud to grow unchecked. Officials hesitated, worried that scrutiny would be seen as discriminatory, and this hesitation proved costly. Accusations of racial bias were used to intimidate investigators and stall action, letting the scheme expand unchecked. The threat of controversy became a shield for those orchestrating the fraud, making it even harder to intervene. This case forces a tough conversation about accountability, public trust, and the dangers of weaponizing identity politics. When fear overrides responsibility, the very people meant to be protected are put at risk. In this chapter, we'll break down how the fraud worked, who was involved, and how accusations of racism delayed the response. We'll follow the money, trace the connections, and reveal the warning signs that were missed or ignored. The Feeding Our Future scandal is a stark lesson. Protecting public funds must come before fear of political backlash. When oversight fails, the consequences ripple through entire communities. It's a reminder that oversight and integrity are non-negotiable, even in the most sensitive situations. Only by facing uncomfortable truths can we prevent history from repeating itself. The fraud took advantage of federal child nutrition programs that were rapidly expanded during the COVID-19 pandemic, as the government tried to ensure no child went hungry during school closures and economic hardship. Feeding Our Future, a Minnesota-based nonprofit, acted as a middleman between the state and hundreds of food distribution sites, claiming to help feed children in need. The organization, led by Amy Bach, received millions in state and federal funds to oversee and sponsor these sites, many of which were newly created and closely linked to Minnesota's Somali American community, a group often underserved and overlooked. These sites submitted claims for hundreds of thousands of meals supposedly served to children, but prosecutors say the vast majority of these meals never existed, and the paperwork was pure fiction. Fake invoices and meal rosters, sometimes generated using random name websites, were used to inflate the numbers and siphon millions of taxpayer dollars away from the children who actually needed help. In 2019, Feeding Our Future handled just $3.4 million. By 2021 that number had exploded to nearly $200 million, a staggering increase that raised few alarms at the time. The operation grew into a sprawling network of shell companies and complicit individuals, laundering money through luxury cars, expensive homes, and even overseas real estate investments. Food suppliers and site operators allegedly created mountains of fake paperwork for food that was never delivered, and for children who never received a single meal. Many of the supposed distribution sites were nothing more than empty storefronts or closed restaurants, yet they claimed to feed thousands of children every single day, with no evidence of real food distribution. The entire scheme was built on a foundation of falsified documents, forged signatures, and brazen lies that went undetected for months. Prosecutors describe it as a highly coordinated conspiracy, involving dozens of people working together, not just opportunism, but a deliberate and organized effort to defraud the government. The scale and speed of the fraud were staggering, leaving investigators scrambling to keep up as the money vanished and the paper trail grew ever more complex. Minnesota's Department of Education began noticing troubling signs as early as 2020, claims for impossible numbers of meals, far beyond what seemed reasonable for the communities being served. Alongside these suspicious claims, there was a sudden surge in new food sites, many run by people with little or no experience in food distribution. Alarmed, officials tried to halt payments and demanded documentation to prove that meals were actually being served to children in need. But instead of providing the requested proof, Feeding Our Future responded by suing the state, claiming the department was discriminating against its East African and Muslim partners. The lawsuit quickly shifted the public conversation from concerns about fraud to accusations of racism, putting state regulators on the defensive and drawing media attention. In court, a judge sided with Feeding Our Future, ruling that the state had not provided enough evidence to justify stopping payments and ordering the department to resume funding. This court order, combined with the public accusations of racism, forced the state to keep paying millions of dollars to an organization already under suspicion for fraud. Regulators' hands were tied. Even as their concerns grew, they were unable to act decisively, and the fraud continued to expand unchecked. The legal and political climate made it nearly impossible to enforce accountability, as any attempt to intervene risked further accusations of bias or discrimination. The first real effort to stop the fraud was effectively neutralized by the threat of being labeled discriminatory, leaving officials in a precarious position. In this environment of hesitation, fear, and mounting pressure, the scheme was able to thrive, growing larger and more brazen with each passing month. Accusations of racism became a deliberate shield for those involved in the scandal. Suspects used claims of racial targeting to intimidate officials and deflect scrutiny, both in court and in public. In a secretly recorded meeting, suspects told the Attorney General they were targeted only because of race, putting investigators in a no-win situation. This narrative shifted focus from evidence of fraud to the motivations of investigators, chilling oversight. The same tactic appeared in jury tampering. A juror was offered $120,000 to acquit, with the bribe framed as defending the Somali community. Feeding Our Future's lawsuit painted the organization as a victim, drowning out legitimate regulatory concerns. The result, real oversight was silenced by louder politically charged accusations. The constant threat of being labeled racist created a climate of fear within Minnesota's Department of Education. Officials hesitated to act, worried about lawsuits and public backlash. A legislative audit confirmed that fear of negative media attention led to delayed enforcement and weak oversight. Local politicians, including city council members and state senators, publicly sided with Feeding Our Future, framing the issue as racial discrimination. This political pressure made it even harder for regulators to act decisively. Even Governor Tim Walz declined to use his subpoena power, likely due to the charged atmosphere. State officials were caught between suspicions of massive fraud and a campaign threatening to brand them as racists. The result? Millions more dollars lost each month as the fraud continued unchecked. The system was paralyzed by fear. The effectiveness of racism accusations was rooted in Minnesota's political landscape, especially in Minneapolis. The state's large politically active Somali American community is a key voting bloc, making politicians wary of alienating them. When Feeding Our Future framed the investigation as an attack on the community, officials faced a tough choice: support regulators or risk losing political support. The fraud was embedded within a segment of the community, complicating law enforcement's response. Over 70 people, mostly of Somali descent, were charged, making any action vulnerable to being misrepresented as targeting the entire community. Media outlets were also hesitant to report aggressively, fearing accusations of racism or Islamophobia. The scandal remained under the radar until federal indictments forced it into the spotlight. By then, hundreds of millions had already been stolen. While state officials hesitated, the FBI launched its own investigation, free from local political pressures. In January 2022, the FBI raided dozens of locations, uncovering overwhelming evidence of a massive conspiracy. Bank records, fake invoices, and spreadsheets revealed the scale of the fraud and the blatant enrichment of those involved. In September 2022, federal prosecutors indicted 47 people, including Feeding Our Future's founder Amy Bach. The number would grow to over 70. The indictments detailed how bribes were paid for approving fraudulent claims. Federal intervention broke through the narrative of racial persecution, shifting focus to the evidence. With the Department of Justice involved, the shield of racism accusations lost its power. The case became one of the largest white-collar prosecutions in Minnesota's history. Federal prosecutions have led to numerous guilty pleas and convictions, despite attempts at jury tampering. The scandal has forced Minnesota to confront its failures in oversight and the political pressures that enabled the fraud. Legislative reports criticize the Department of Education, but acknowledge the impossible position created by courts and politics. The case has sparked debate about reforming oversight and the influence of politics on public programs. The Somali American community has faced unfair stigma, even as leaders condemned the fraud and cooperated with authorities. The legal process continues, with more trials ahead and little hope of recovering all the stolen money. Some officials believe the fraud extends beyond this program, possibly involving billions in state aid. Feeding Our Future stands as a cautionary tale of how vulnerabilities, both procedural and political, can be exploited on a massive scale. The Feeding Our Future scandal is a sobering lesson in the dangers of letting fear override accountability. When officials hesitate out of fear of being labeled racist, oversight collapses and criminal schemes thrive. Hundreds of millions meant for hungry children were stolen. Public trust was shattered, and a community was unfairly stigmatized. The case shows the danger of letting accusations of bias silence legitimate inquiry. Real justice requires courage to follow the facts, regardless of political risk. Strong leadership and honest dialogue are essential to distinguish between genuine discrimination and its cynical exploitation. Protecting public funds and ensuring aid reaches those in need must always come first. Only by insisting on transparency and accountability can we prevent future scandals like this one.